We'll just give it a couple more seconds for everyone to join. And good evening, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome. My name's Dr. Michelle Lim, and I'm speaking to you from Wallamada, the unceded sovereign lands of the Wadamadugal clan of the Darug Nation. I pay my respects to elders past and present who have sustained land, waters, country since the beginning of time. Today, I am delighted to wear two hats to introduce Associate Professor Surabhi Ranganathan. And this is the first time that the Centre of Environmental Law at Macquarie University has joined with the Biodiversity Law Specialist Group of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law to bring to you in partnership this Law and Nature Dialogue webinar series. And later on, I'll put in the chat box a link to the World Commission on Environmental Law. For anyone who's not a member, feel free to join the commission and tick the Biodiversity Law Specialist Group box. If you are already a member and interested in our brand new Biodiversity Law group, do get in touch. But back to the reason why we have gathered here today, it is my great pleasure to introduce Associate Professor Surabhi Ranganathan from the Faculty of Law, University of Cambridge, and she is the co-acting director of the Lauterpacht Centre for International Law at Cambridge. And we are very excited today because Surabhi's work is in this really interesting space of exploring not only place, but also looking at histories, how they may inform our futures, and what that means for us right now in the context, in particular, of the law of the sea. And I was expressing to Surabhi earlier how much I just love the title itself. And as you've all been waiting for, everybody, over to Surabhi, who will be talking about terra/aqueous, vexing vents, and amphibious legalities in the Anthropocene. Surabhi, welcome.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that introduction. Thank you also to Nengie for the invitation to be here and to all of you for attending. Good evening to you in Sydney and good morning, a very, very early good morning to you from Cambridge. As my title suggests, as Michelle mentioned, I'm going to talk about quite strange, remote, seemingly alien places that yet throw up deeply familiar and fundamental questions of how we see and order the world. The places I'm going to talk about are hydrothermal vents, which are found in the deep ocean, usually at points where the Earth's tectonic plates are pulling apart. I'll talk about how they are formed a bit later in the talk. Let me start with telling you a little bit about their discovery. So let's cast our mind back to the 1970s. By this time, agreement had been reached after protracted method wars on the theory of continental drift, though now in the more sophisticated form of plate tectonics. This map that you see on the slide before you had a role to play in the recognition of this theory. This is one of a series of maps created by the underpaid, undersung, underthanked oceanographer Marie Tharp, who, beginning with the bed of the North Atlantic Ocean, had used available data, cartographic technique, and lots of imagination to build a comprehensive picture of the ocean, including showing a system of drift valleys that were consistent with the prediction of continental drift. Tharp's maps caused her colleagues to groan when they realized what they implied, but the maps also helped to convince them. And certainly with evidence piling up in its favor, by the 1970s, scientists not only fully accepted continental drift as the explanation for the formation of the Earth's surface, but they were also excited to study the oceanic sites that this theory predicted, and these included hydrothermal vents. So in February 1977, the research vessel Noor chugged off to explore the Galapagos Rift and the vents to be found there. On board ship were 30 scientists. They included physicists, geologists, chemists. There was also a journalist to write home about discoveries to the San Francisco Chronicle. But there were no biologists because the team had had no expectation of finding life at these vents. It was not thought that life could exist in places like rifts and hydrothermal vents. And so they were caught completely by surprise. For not only were the landscapes exquisite, all domes and dreaming spires, they were also teeming with life. So unprepared were the crew that not only they had no biologist to pick up, to sample the kinds of specimens they found, they also had no medium in which to preserve the samples that they collected, and they had to use their own stock of shipboard vodka. The degree of sort of amazement felt is, I think you can sort of read it in the kinds of language that some of them reached for. You have in the slide before you a quote from one of the scientists who was on the cruise, Tjeerd van Andel, who describes so just coming, sort of being in the deep ocean and then suddenly coming across this place that looks like this massive desert oasis with no idea of where it comes from, but sort of, almost, I mean, this is a scientist writing about the wonderment that he feels about the kinds of things that he finds in the ocean floor. You can also hear the excitement, I think, in the surprised laughter that you're going to hear in this clip that I'm going to play for you. This is a little clip of a scientist called Jack Collis, who was on the cruise and who is actually speaking from a submersible. So he had gone down from the shipboard down to the ocean floor, and he's reporting back on what he is seeing there.
We have a really good one. Looks like the clam baker, 122244. And only shells.
So I think that's sort of, I need to stop. So I think that laughter tells you quite a lot. There's this sort of sudden surprise that, a place that they thought would be basically just rock and, water and sort of geology turns out to have actually quite a lot of biology. The crews not only discovered life at vents, they also discovered life that was completely alien in form. This is because vent life subsists on the principle of chemosynthesis, which is quite different from the principle of photosynthesis, which is how we receive our food. Vent microbes, bacteria, and viruses use chemicals, sulfur particularly, rather than sunlight to break down energy. And this is what a number of other creatures of more complex biology subsist upon. And here in this picture, you see a description, a chart showing you some of the kinds of life forms that you find at hydrothermal vents. They are, this is, as I said, life quite unlike any other, though it takes quite recognizable in terms of how it's configured, but it takes forms that are recognizable also in other food webs. Now, if it was not exciting enough that these scientists had managed to discover entirely new ecosystems, entirely new food chains, they also found seabed mineral resources in completely new types of ore formations. So until the point of this cruise, the ore formations in the seabed that had been known were manganese nodules, and I'll be talking a little bit about them in due course. What the crews found in the domes and dreaming spires were actually mineral stores of much higher grade metals, suggesting a far more promising resource. And again, you can see the sort of, this was reported back with great fanfare to the public in the US, in the United States. You can also see the excitement in the kinds of descriptions some people reached for when they talked about the mineral resources of hydrothermal vents, comparing vent resources to manganese nodules in terms of holding fistfuls of gold versus tiny flakes. So as the law of the sea enthusiasts here know, manganese nodules were at this time quite a lot in the news. They were in fact at the heart of a major ongoing lawmaking initiative, the Third UN Conference on the Law of the Sea, which ran from 1973 to 1982 and adopted the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Manganese nodules were the reason why the conference ran for such a long period, and also why it was poised then in 1977 in such a fraught moment. Perhaps because of, and I can go into this a little bit more in the Q&A, but I will just say that perhaps it was because of this reason of timing, 1977, and all the tensions in the conference, that events didn't actually attract much attention. The conference did not react to new discoveries. Events did not find their way to the center of the discussion, and as a result are only very obliquely referenced in the text. So you have Article 133A of the UNCLOS 1982, which includes vents indirectly in its definition of the resources of the international seabed area, although it mentions polymetallic nodules, manganese nodules, directly. Vent life is mentioned in a very general way in the reference to the flora and fauna of the marine environment, and vent microbes, which are ironically now the focus of a lot of biotechnological and pharmaceutical interest, find no mention at all. Now, given the current economic interest in vents, you might think that the relative neglect by the UNCLOS was actually a missed opportunity. But I submit to you that for what the UNCLOS was trying to do at the time, vents were much more of a lucky miss, or what even some of you who are cricket fans might think of as a well left. And why is that? And here is where I want to make two of the four main points of my talk. Firstly, what the UNCLOS was engaged in doing was producing a rather simplified picture of the ocean, carving it up into discrete resource sites with resource extraction given normative heft through different languages: the language of freedom for navigation, optimum use for fisheries, and the most sophisticated of the lot, the language of the common heritage of mankind, which connected the extraction of deep seabed minerals to ideas of common benefit. Secondly, then, if this is what the UNCLOS was trying to do, vents would have disrupted this process because they failed to fall within the kinds of neat categories that UNCLOS was creating. So let's start with my first point, and say a little bit more about what the UNCLOS was doing. So what the UNCLOS does, if you read the UNCLOS text, is that it divides the ocean by zones, national and international. It then further subdivides these zones by medium, so that within each zone, you have different land and water regimes. And then it basically uses a bunch of principles of binary classifications between life and matter, between fixity and mobility, to locate a variety of contents of the ocean. So it tells us what lies where oil lies, for example, where marine life is supposed to exist, and where mineral resources are to be found. UNCLOS, in short, reconstructs the ocean, teaching us to see it as divided rather than connected, and to think of its resources as lying in particular places, for example, on the seabed or in the water. The divisions it enacts can be fictitious. For example, the classification of crustaceans, which swim as sedentary species. And in areas beyond national jurisdiction, the divisions are also particularly stark. Here, we learn to think of all marine life that is configured as resource as basically belonging to the seawater, so being part of the regime of the high seas, and all mineral resources as lying on the seabed. Now, these divisions between zones, between mediums, between different categories of resources don't work particularly well for a lot of the ocean, but vents especially call them into question. Let us see how. So let's start with the UNCLOS's medium-based divisions, separating seabed and seawater regimes, regimes of solid land from regimes of liquid water. How does that actually work for vents? So here is how vents are formed. Seawater percolates through rifts in the ocean floor, mixing with the hot magma underneath, where it becomes hot and mineral rich, and then sort of shoots back up through the cracks, where it precipitates into these domes and spires that I was describing. This is a continuous dynamic process of the mixing of land and water, which makes the distinction between land and water regimes, between solid and liquid regimes, an irrelevant one, right? Consider then the Unclasses distinction between life and matter, between things that live, so marine living resources, and between things that do not, mineral resources, as a basis for classification, as a basis for placing the one in the regime of the water and the other in the regime of the land. And as I said, in areas beyond national jurisdiction, that is the strict binary classification. But again, at vents, minerals and marine life are completely intertwined. Chemosynthetic microbes are encrusted in and on the domes and spires, and other creatures are wrapped around, often attached to the chimneys, to these domes and spires that are created out of the precipitation of seabed minerals. So it is hard to know where where matter ends and life begins. But this is also the case for other reasons. So vent communities push at our very understanding of the boundaries of life, at our very understanding of this question of where exactly does life begin and matter end. This has to do with, of course, that at these places, life is found at temperatures and pressures where it was thought that life simply could not exist. But it has to do also with the nature of the life forms that you find at vents. So vent communities are made up, as I said, their starting point is a bunch of microbes, bacteria, and viruses, some of which have only very dubious claims to be even considered alive. This is certainly a question that is often asked about viruses. Do viruses actually live? Vent communities are also sites where these microbes engage in what is called lateral genes transfer. So unlike all of us, where we engage in something called vertical gene transfer, where we, of course, we inherit genes from our parents and pass them on to our children. Microbes engage in contemporaneous gene transfer, where creatures are basically exchanging genes and at the rate of 20 billion times per second in these hot spaces of the vents, which again makes it difficult to think of any of these creatures as embodied, as having a single body. What you have instead is this massive collective body of organisms, some of which are seen as living, such as bacteria, some of which are of dubious legality, viruses, and other things are simply matter. It's hard to know then where matter stops and life begins. And the problem then is that UNCLOS tries to fix relationships in the ocean, emphasizing for each regime what is the resource and what is its environment, the former to be used, the latter to be protected from serious harm. But as with economic interest growing in the harvesting of vent communities, just consider the confusion that follows for any 1 square inch of the ocean floor. Seen from the perspective of the seabed regime, the minerals are the resource, and the vent life in which these minerals are encrusted is simply the environment. Seen from the perspective of the vent communities, which are now rebranded as marine genetic resources and therefore of economic interest, vent life is the resource, and the minerals that surround them are the environment, defining what it means to access them in situ. So what exactly then is that square inch? Is it the seabed or high seas? Is it land or water? Is it matter or life? Is it terra or aqueous? Vents intensify our understanding of the instability of UNCLOS classifications. And so, as I said just as well for the UNCLOS, that it did avoid contending with them in 1982, and also later on in 1994, when it was concluded the supplementing agreement to the 1982 convention, the 1994 agreement on the deep seabed. But let's talk about now. So with growing resource interest in both vent life and vent minerals, the questions of classification and applicable regimes have acquired a new urgency and immediate practical context. And on cue, we have 2 ongoing lawmaking processes that have it within their remit to articulate specific vent regimes. There is, of course, the BBNJ process, the negotiations on access and sustainable use of biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. And then there is the International Seabed Authority, which is currently completing work on a mining code, which will be applicable to a variety of seabed minerals, from nodules to vent minerals. And both processes, by the very nature of their current work, by the very virtue of the fact that there is an interest both in seabed minerals and in the biodiversity of hydrothermal vents, have to try and make sense of these liminal places. So how do they do that? And the short answer, and this is the third main point of my talk, is that they do so by basically erasing the vexing liminalities that they find and by reinscribing the vents into either the high seas regime or the seabed regime, depending on which one they take as their starting point. So let's look at the seabed regime first, the work that the International Seabed Authority is doing. Now, the International Seabed Authority, and as you see, has already given out 7 exploration contracts for vent sites in the mid-Atlantic and the Southern Indian Ocean. It does have already exploration regulations, which it adopted in 2010, which deal with vents, here mentioned in how we usually, the formal way in which we refer to them, which is as polymetallic sulfides. Now, these regulations are interesting. On the one hand, they do seem to say something that is particular to vents. They do distinguish between vents and other types of mineral resources, such as polymetallic nodules, for certain purposes, for purposes that have to do with setting out the obligations of the contractors who explore these sites to the International Seabed Authority. So the regulations are bespoke when it comes for vents, when it comes to things like calculating the contract area that can be awarded, or options for how the fee has to be paid, or the ways in which the contractors have to make good on the principle of the common heritage of mankind. But when it comes to other things, such as environmental provisions, you see that there is no difference drawn between vent minerals and polymetallic nodules. And I should say here, I'm not even making the bigger critique that the environmental provisions are not suitable. I'm saying that they're not even particular to vents. They are just standard environmental provisions that are just applied to seabed mining, regardless of the very specific nature of vent minerals as a resource. Now, of course, the International Seabed Authority would point out that maybe when I make this critique, I'm only looking at the ball language of the exploration regulations, but that in its operational practices, the authority has a lot more going on. For example, it is adopting regional environment management plans for different parts of the seabed. Yeah, well and good. The problem is the practice shows a grayer picture. So as I said, exploration contracts have already been given out for vents, but the regional environment management plan for the first vent site in the mid-Atlantic is now under discussion. So exploration has much preceded the development of a regional environment plan. And this first site for which the contract has been given out and yet the plan is yet to be adopted, by the way, is a site that has vents not just of usual sort of biological importance, but vents that have been particularly singled out as of particular scientific interest because they might hold clues to the origins of life on Earth and are therefore earmarked for inclusion as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. To sum up then, the ISA is of course working towards strengthening its environmental provisions, but has so far not actually specifically articulated an understanding of vents that seems to recognize what sets them apart from other kinds of seabed mineral resources, and basically reinscribes vents into the seabed regime, scrubbing away the complex liminality. And you might say, maybe as an international organization with a very specific mandate to regulate, to administer seabed mining, that is about all it can do. It can't really unmake the conditions of its own creation. So what then about the BBNJ process, which is a new treaty-making exercise? What use does it make of that fact to perhaps knit back the divided ocean and to unmake some of these categories? And the answer is not much. The BBNJ, as those of you who follow it will know, is a rather limited endeavor under a grander title. So yes, it is a new treaty-making exercise, but this treaty has to be made under quite specific conditions of adherence to the structures of the law of the sea as they stand at present. Vents do feature in the question of a regime for accessing and using marine genetic resources. And here, positions remain divided. They are divided between those who are happy to continue classifying Vent Life as a high seas resource, so bringing it under the principle of the freedom of the seas, although leavened a little bit by benefit sharing. Those who wish to reclassify vents as a seabed resource, to say vent life should basically be brought under the principle of the common heritage of mankind. And the division between groups that want the one or the other remains rather fraught. But the key problem is that neither of these positions, fought over as they may be, actually do resolve the boundary question. Both of them have the same problem, because on the one hand, if Vent Life is a high seas resource, or is even a sui generis resource, as some people suggest, then the question is how to draw the line, again, between Vent Life and minerals. And then, on the other hand, if that problem of drawing a boundary between minerals and matter at vents is seen as the real problem, and Vent Life is reclassified as under the principle of the common heritage of mankind as part of the seabed regime, then how to draw the distinction between vent life and other life that exists in the ocean, including in the benthic zone. So as I said, vent life is distinctive in some of the chemosynthetic processes on which it relies, but in terms of form, it's not that distinct from life you find elsewhere. And certainly there is a lot of engagement between vent life and other kinds of life in the sea. It's hard to say, again, that chemosynthetic life stops at one place and another kind of life takes over, because that's simply not how things work. And the problem is, raising these problems then is once these problems are raised, they're seen as so intractable that they're simply brushed aside. And the hope is that they will be resolved by post hoc regime coordination between the different regimes that are set up and between the different kinds of institutions that will be in place to manage these regimes, so that the International Seabed Authority and whatever institution that is set up under the BBNJ will find some way to coordinate their activities. But again, it brings us right back to this question of, well, what happens when multiple interests converge on a single square inch? Who gets to decide what that square inch is? And so here is what is going on with both the BBNJ and the International Seabed Authority. Confronted with the vexed liminality of vents, they choose simply to disappear the problem or to postpone it, not really dwelling on the invitations that vents offered, thinking about the very classifications and divisions that the Unclass enacts and how to unmake or question perhaps those classifications and divisions. Instead of doing that, they simply reinscribe vents into their preferred regimes. And so both perhaps can be characterized, and this is my fourth point, as fixes. The concept of the fix, as you know, was theorized by David Harvey in relation to spatial fixes. And as he noted, a fix has several interrelated aspects. A fix refers to a fixing in place of infrastructure that enables accumulation. Unclass itself was that kind of fix. It was part of that infrastructure which stabilized relationships in the deep seabed and created basically extraction-ready sites. And these processes at the ISA and the BBNJ are adding to that vis-a-vis new types of resources, such as vent minerals and vent microbes. A fix, Harvey said, is also a temporary solution to crises of accumulation that have been brought about due to that infrastructure and due to the contradictions of that infrastructure. And here, to the extent that the liminality of vents poses a challenge, we have regimes that basically erase that liminality by reinscribing vents into simplified regimes. And a fix can also be understood in a third way, more colloquially, as, for example, as your morning fix, marketed as meeting a desire. And this, of course, was also true both of the Unclass, which relied on a huge number of justifications from supply security to common heritage of mankind for its sort of legitimation, and these processes, which are again brought to us in the language of operationalizing common heritage of mankind or delivering the common benefit. So read this way, vents become the latest chapter in a long and bleak history of the law of the sea, one of unchanging extractive rationality with fixes all the way, and with a predetermined future. If we know that this is what the law of the sea has always done, then we know what we can expect from it as the future goes along. Now, this, however, and this is really the point of my fourth point, that yes, what is going on at the moment is fixing, in the Harvey sense, the law of the sea. But this to say that UNCLOS was only that would also be to miss the point of the exercise that it was. So yes, UNCLOS did enact a fix in all three senses, as infrastructure, as a solution to crises, as a sort of object of desire. But it was not only that. At least at its outset, UNCLOS 3, the Third UN Conference on the Law of the Sea, which enacted the 1982 treaty, was also a genuine effort at world making, especially by third world states who saw it as a test case for the new international economic order. It was an exercise that directly engaged the ways in which ideas of decolonization were framed at the time. Now, of course, these ideas had limits at the time. World making in that moment came up against the pressures of state making, which meant the privileging of particular rationalities and epistemologies and the erasure of others. Third world states at UNCLOS accepted the tenets of extraction, of remaking nature by law, of catering to corporate rationality, etc. But until they ran out of steam, they sought to place all of these in contexts of distributive justice between states and in the context of leveling historical relationships of colonialism. What about the present initiatives? Where is their connection to similar distributive debates of the day? And here I would like us to actually stay with the irony, because you see, many would argue that we live in a moment of much greater acknowledgement, not only of climate crises and of the disproportionate processes that brought it about, but also that we hold a shared understanding of decolonization that seems to go beyond the Holocenic projects of the 1970s that could privilege extractive rationality, that once marginal critiques have now found their way to the center stage. And yet, ironically, our supposedly more fecund understandings seem to translate into rather arid processes, both at the BBNJ and at the ISA. Because unlike UNCLOS, the ISA and BBNJ seem not to have any accompanying politics of decolonization. And this is consequential because if they had such politics, surely we would be looking at different kinds of regimes. And we can talk a bit in the Q&A about what those might look like. But certainly regimes that unmake rather than reinscribe UNCLOS's neat divisions, taking the liminality of events as an invitation and as a spur to the imagination. Because in the end, the questions that Wentz ask us are not actually technical questions about classification, but fundamental questions of epistemology and about politics, about how we see the world and draw its dividing lines between land and water, between what stays and what moves, and who stays and who moves, and what is the better fate between the two, between life and matter, and who carries the costs of these decisions. So I'd like to stop here and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Surabhi. And I'm sure everyone has like a virtual applause for you that you're hearing from around the world. And I can see that we've already got questions in the chat box, but I'd just like to say thank you so much for highlighting in such an evocative way the metaphors you use about the filleting of international law, really bringing to the fore this really, on the one hand, things that I'd never heard about before, like chemosynthesis instead of photosynthesis. But on the other hand, as you're concluding on issues that have continued to be there and just won't go away. And the point you, in many ways, ended on in terms of thinking about what other regimes might look like, what could be there. And I'll go now to the start of many questions from Diana Sebra. Diana, if you'd like to ask your question in person, feel free to unmute and turn on your video if you'd like to do so. If not, indicate to me in the chat that you'd just like us to discuss your question through the chat.
Hello.
Go
Hello,
ahead.
everyone.
Welcome.
Well, I don't know why my video is not working, but my question to Professor is how you see the possibility of overlapping the mineral exploitation and bioprospection. So in a hypothetical scenario, a state that is exploiting vents under the International Seabed Authority regime starts bioprospecting a microbe or any other organism for profit. So how you would see this situation? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. This is a great question, and you basically hit the nail on the head, right? This is a problem. So again, the hope is that this is the kind of thing that institutions will find a way to coordinate around, so that, of course, each regime will come with its own specific formal requirements of what you need to do to be able to access resources of the ocean. So the idea is that the ocean floor and with once the BBNJ regime is in place, if it has the provisions that some states wanted to have, it won't neither will be seen as an open access regime where you can simply go and take things. You actually have to have specific permission to be able to make use of oceanic resources. Certainly the regime of the seabed is more detailed and more complex in terms of the requirements that are in place before you can begin to engage in commercial activity of exploration or exploitation. And the idea is that the BBNJ regime should also have, if not common heritage style provisions, but provisions that actually do limit access or condition access on a whole set of obligations of benefit sharing. But the practical problem is, of course, that these things sound very nice on paper, but as I said, these things are vents are intensely concentrated places where and you can't really police what is happening on the vent or in vents as you can perhaps you can't even really police what happens on land, but you can certainly not police what is happening on vents. So yeah, practically what you're suggesting is the possibility in a way of biopiracy, and of course it is not clear that there is any way of preventing it. But the fact that it might happen is the problem. I think the difficulty will be if we see the problem as being that some actors might act in unlawful ways or might actually violate the terms of a regime by taking things that they might not take or engaging in an economic activity for which they're not sanctioned. The fact that they can do that and that is what is not addressed in the regime should actually bring us right back to the structures of the regime. Why have we set up these regimes in ways that actually divide what we know to be an interconnected complex place as something that is seen as sort of simplifiable, as divisible, as basically things we can give over to two different regimes, and then things that we can leave to the sort of hapless coordination between institutions afterwards, as opposed to thinking with a number of alternative models that had been propounded during the UNCLOS negotiations in the 1970s, for example, which did try to see the ocean itself and certainly the deep ocean as a unified space, subject to more unified forms of regulation that covered all of ocean space, not dividing seabed and seawater in the ways that your question brings out as problematic. So thank you.
I can see lots of questions coming in. I'll go to Zhang Kang and then to Nengye. Kang's question is, how do nations' freedom of research over marine genetic resources in the high seas and deep seabed overlap in the provisions between the Law of the Sea Convention and the CBD, and also bringing in the issue of the heritage, common heritage of mankind?
Yeah, so again, the difference there is, so you're then bringing up the other problem, right? Which is that the division between national and international jurisdiction. So what is the remit of rules that apply to the same resources in areas within national jurisdiction? And what happens when we have a separate rule system for, again, areas beyond national jurisdiction, when you do have a continuity between resources? I think that is the question you're asking in terms of the overlap, but perhaps could you clarify if that is what you're getting at in your question?
Did you want to turn on your, did you want to ask in person? That clarifies it. Well, we'll go to Ningyi in the meantime, and Kang, if you'd like to continue the discussion by turning on your video and microphone, please do so. And Ningyi, please.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Surabhi. Your presentation is absolutely fascinating, and I'm particularly interested in understanding a little bit more to look into the law of the sea or UNCLOS through a post-colonial or like decolonization lens. I mean, I think that's kind of the core your lens into this topic. So I know that you were there during the BBNJ IGC3. So my question to you is a little bit kind of broader than your talk about the when. Is what is your observation? So when you were observing the IGC3 through a lens of the decolonization, are they in that process? Is there anything they can do better through this lens? And also, maybe also going back to that debate about the common heritage of mankind. So do you think that during the UNCLOS negotiation in the 1970s, when Malta raised this common heritage of mankind regime, was that an effort of decolonization? So that's kind of I'm quite interested in all this around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. So thank you for both questions. So let me start in reverse order. Let me start with the 70s and we'll come to the present after that. So yeah, you ask a good question. What was Malta up to when they brought this issue before the UN General Assembly, when they initiated this debate on deep seabed mining? Was it decolonization? Now, this is an interesting question. I've done some work on this. I've looked at the speech that Arvid Pardo had made, the famous speech in 1967, which seemed to start, set the ball rolling. And I've tried to contextualize it in the politics of what he was trying to do, both domestically for Malta and vis-a-vis the seabed. And the argument I made was that Pardo himself was perhaps only, at least initially, only strategically interested in the ocean. He was not particularly, I mean, he is seen as, there's a statue to him in Malta, which calls him the father of the new law of the sea. So sort of distinguishing him from sort of Grotius, the father of the old law of the sea, somebody who's clearly, seen as giving birth to this new idea of the common heritage principle. But the argument I made is that he is not actually, I mean, yes, he did articulate the common heritage, he did bring to the General Assembly the proposal to look at the deep seabed, but this was not the prime interest. His prime interest was, he was recruited also for this purpose, was to really put Malta on the map, so to speak. Malta was a new post-colonial state. He was almost headhunted. He used to work for the UN General Assembly. And the brief was, he was given a very small office. There were, I think, 3 people at the UN. And he had to find some way of making Malta prominent, because that would help them in a number of disputes that were cropping up around rights in the Mediterranean and other things. And so he looked at a whole bunch of different issues, regulating arms trade, for example, and other things. Those came a cropper, and then basically lit upon the deep ocean as strategically a good issue to bring up, something that had not really, that was being talked about in various circles, but he could maybe make the big push at the UN General Assembly. And then he sort of fell in with people for whom, this became something much more of a passion project. So with Elizabeth Mann-Borghese and so on, and, became part of movements that did a lot of work around the common heritage principle. But the start of it, you're right, perhaps for him, it was a decolonization in the project, in the sense that he was trying to see what the seabed could do for Malta, but it was not a decolonization project for him in terms of what it meant to think about the seabed as the common heritage principle. But Pardo, of course, was only one figure, right? The idea he proposed was picked up, embraced, and turned by a bunch of third world states into a specific decolonization project. And we see that particularly in some of the proposals they made for how the seabed was to be accessed. So one idea was that you can mine the seabed, so you can, of course, extract resources from it, but only through a monopoly enterprise. So you wouldn't have what we currently have, the system of competitive mining, where contractors from all over the world can basically get states to sponsor them and then file for exploration licenses. Instead, you would have a single international organ that would act as the collective sort of mining arm of the world, right? So it was actually called the Enterprise after Star Trek Enterprise. And the idea was that it would reflect not only commercial, not only sort of money in terms of the money that the recovery of resources could bring, but also symbolically it would be an act of third world states participating in a high-tech industry in the extraction of mineral resources, not being just resource sites in themselves, right? Which was what colonialism was. So in that sense, third world states did turn seabed mining for a while into a post-colonial project, but that dissipated. And 77, as I've said, was a turning point in the process. Now, coming to your, so can I actually ask you, in answer to your question, I went to IGC 3, but you went to IGC 4. What did you observe? Was it a productive meeting? Did you feel that there was a lot of sort of politics of decolonization in the room?
So my general impression when I was there is like a kind of a yesterday once more, like a deja vu, because I was actually very pleased to a certain extent, because I saw, at least when I was there, I saw this revitalized Group 77 plus China. And I mean, they have been very active, and they do have coordination before the official meeting. And yes, all the kind of debates during the meeting is about those yesterday once more topic, like common heritage of mankind, benefit sharing, access to and benefit sharing, and also the kind of the transfer technology. So it's kind of like, well, of course I wasn't old enough to participate the Unclasses negotiation, but according to
nor was I. I don't think.
According to my preliminary archive studies, it's very similar to what they debated in the Unclasses negotiation. I mean, especially when it comes to marine genetic resources. So yeah, so that's why I think my two questions to you are related. Like, I was trying to figure out, well, if this common heritage of mankind is kind of part of the decolonization project, and then what is going on now? Like, can they do better? I mean, or if so, let me just try to give a little bit more context. I was very pleased because I came to New York with a very pessimistic feeling about this world. Like, we are living in a very geopolitically intense world, like the US-China tension and so on, war. But there in the room, it was pretty much like still the old days developed countries dichotomy. But the thing is, then comes to my question is like, okay, well, good, I get that dichotomy is nothing new, but is there anything they can do better? Because this is supposed to be a future-proofing new treaty to govern 64% of the world ocean. So I mean, I'm quite interested in your observation.
So you have exactly summed it up, right? So the problem is, yes, you're right. There's a weird sense of deja vu when you walk into these rooms, because some of the language you see, this debate over, well, should how should marine genetic resources be classified? Should the common heritage of mankind principle be applied or not? This sort of feels like, that same north-south debate is happening. But I'll say but there's 2 points to note about this debate, right? Firstly, it's a debate that feels remarkably sterile because it seems to play out. It's really a pattern debate, right? One side will get up and say one thing, another side will get up and say one thing. We know exactly how this pattern plays out because we've seen it so many times. We also know, in a way, you can predict almost every word of what is going to be said, right? So my main sense of attending BBNJ IGC 3 was I enjoyed it, but I found it also, in a weird way, I was like, I would rather sit down and just read the debates of the 1970s, because at least there was a sense that these things were being said, they meant something, right? It wasn't this sort of this it was not this ritualized performance. But the other thing, and this is what you were saying right now, right, is that it's amazing that the position, so in a way, we have, to the extent that it is this ritualized rehearsal of what is going on, this is the concept of decolonization of the 70s that is playing itself out, right? Whereas the world is not that. So China plus G77, I mean, a lot of the countries within that now we know casually use the idea of being southern countries, right? My country, India or China, I mean, they have to, it's not the playing out of that kind of very statist north-south divide in a time when we should be actually thinking about what the states themselves are doing as post-colonial states. That's not present in the room. This is not the politics of decolonization for the concepts of decolonization that we carry in the present. This is a politics of decolonization in the very sort of, state-making way of the 60s and 70s, which then is out of time. It's sort of, it relies on the extractive certainties that we don't actually have before us. It doesn't take into account all the larger questions about what distribution means today, and how distribution works when you move outside of the status framework and think about actually the North and South in more complex ways. Those things are not actually present, right? So this is why these debates feel both patterned, but also sterile. We know what they're saying, but we also know why nobody's really invested in any of this, right? The thing that is going to make, I don't know what's going to happen with the BBNJ. There's another IGC, I think, coming up, but eventually, I think we know where we are going, right? The interest in actually sort of accessing using biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction is going to be the thing that everybody agrees on after the patterns have played themselves out. And so that's quite depressing. This, as you said, is not then where is the future proofing? Where is this being seen as a treaty for the present time? Where is the sense of conviction that should accompany this, if this is supposed to be the kind of treaty that it is described as, in this environmental treaty or decolonization treaty? I mean, that's not actually there in the room at all.
Yeah, absolutely. Because two things. That first, they don't even define what is marine biodiversity. So that is already kind of like I didn't get it. And second, they rarely talk about environment. They really talk about environment. It's supposed to be an environment treaty, as we all sort of understand, but it's actually not that much about the environment in the negotiation.
Yeah.
So
and climate change barely again mentioned, right? So yeah, the Anthropocene, not a concept. So yeah.
I might bring Kath, if you'd like to ask your question in person. Again, it's a variation on a theme. Go ahead, Kath.
Oh, thank you. And thank you so much for this session and for the wisdom that is put before us by both the speaker and the commentators. I've been contemplating how very anthropocentric the whole discussion is, even though, as has just been noted, supposedly this is about protecting the environment and biodiversity, not just even single species, but all the ecosystem processes. This group has, at least some of them, have been talking many times about the rights of nature itself and the precautionary principle, the ecosystem-based approach. And it's so striking that there's such a lack of information about what the impacts of seabed mining of any of these different kinds are, that the whole framework seems really hopeless. The ISA seems to see its job to be promoting seabed mining. Clearly, the environmental controls are just an afterthought. And I mean, they're not even convinced, as far as I know, that they really will have proper sort of compliance measures. I mean, given the ISA treaty itself, the seabed mining treaty, and the nature of the way the organization is being run, what could be done to actually change the situation, to make consideration of the rights of nature, to implement the precautionary principle in favor of the environment, and to insist on genuine ecological ecosystem-based management? Any thoughts?
Absolutely. No, thank you. I think you have summed it up exactly, right? There is a problem with how, I mean, even so, yes, the ISA. So there's two things. It is true that the ISA since the 1990s has probably done more than, than the UNCLOS certainly had to at least bring the environmental question to the fore. So it has sort of, its regulations say more than the UNCLOS did, but the ISA is extremely limited by what it says its mandate is. So it sees itself it sees as its duty this idea of basically operationalizing seabed mining. And in fact, I think the ISA Secretary General is on record as saying that we cannot reopen these questions about whether seabed mining should proceed or not, because the international community took those decisions 40 years ago. So there is a problem, right? That it's an institution with a very focused idea of what it needs to do that becomes very problematic, precisely because there are so many questions around whether seabed mining is even an activity that deserves support. There is a kind of 70s extractive certainty that drove this interest in seabed mining. A lot of assumptions that have been, it's very clear that they've proven not to be true, right? That there is no impact, that there's no major impact, for example, that seabed mining has on the marine environment. That's simply not true. Studies have shown that the impacts are not only massive, but they're also in a way incalculable. We don't even know the extent of the harms that can be caused. We don't know the spatial extent of the harms, but we also don't know the temporal sort of duration, right? How long harms continue and so forth. And so I am very much in sympathy with and in support of those who are saying that what we need to be able to actually, even if we want to think about seabed mining, in order to be able to actually create a regime that is, sort of that takes into account some of the things you were saying, an ecosystem-based management approach, the precautionary principle. What we need for the moment is a moratorium. We need a decision that seabed mining will not proceed until we at least know a little bit more about the ocean. And that means that what we need to invest in is actually more study of the ocean floor, more understanding of what it is. But I would even go further. So yes, I think the moratorium, pushing for the moratorium is important, and many countries as well as NGOs have now sort of joined in that, so that's good. But I think we need to also, to the extent that we think of the moratorium as a sort of temporary bar with the idea that the activity will resume at some point in the future, I think we need to think about what the shape of that future regime is going to be. Do we want to go back after the moratorium into this sort of model of competitive mining with 30 different mining operations going on in the seafloor? We don't even know that there is an economic case for that kind of mining, let alone the environmental case, which is completely against this form of mining. The post-colonial case is actually against this form of mining. Or do we want to go back and maybe resuscitate some of these ideas of the 1970s, early 70s, which were about thinking, if you had to think about mining, then putting that mining into a context of distribution, right? Into a context of equalizing sort of disparities between the North and South, but thinking of mining as a collective endeavor, as which as opposed to this sort of large new extractive competitive operation where value was understood very much in the sort of very broad crude capitalist terms in which it is created today. So I think we need to think about not just the moratorium, which is the act cause for now, but also what the future looks like, what kind of mining we go back to, if we go back to it in the future.
And can I just add, sorry, one other point, which was, and thank you for that answer, which is that it's increasingly seeming like you can actually get minerals out of the seawater and you don't need to actually go and disturb the seabed. I mean, the lack of knowledge is not just about the ecosystems, but about the evolution of the technology as well. But thank you.
No, and that's exactly right. In fact, I think there are people who also point out that we haven't, one of the reasons why, this is also why the seabed is a bad fix, right? Because to the extent, this is also Harvey's spatial fix, to the extent that we think that we can get new minerals from the ocean floor, we don't think about, not enough is actually invested into then recycling research, what it means to, would we be putting more money into how much more use we make of resources to hand as opposed to opening up new extraction sites. So yes, absolutely. Priorities in terms of not opening up new frontiers, but doing more with what we have is, and that's again an Anthropocene question, right? But it's not on the table at the ISA.
Thanks so much, Surabhi, and for that fascinating discussion, and also the paper itself, and to the fantastic comments from our audience. You've not only given us an encyclopedic understanding of the range of instruments around the ocean, but challenged us to think about how we think about the environment and even life itself. So I know your thunderous applause, everyone's joining me with a thunderous virtual applause. Thank you so much. Mind blown. I learned so much legally, scientifically, values-wise as well. So Thank you so very, very much. And I know on behalf of everyone else who's listening as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Michelle, and for your sharing. It was really fantastic to be able to talk to all of you, and your questions were really, really helpful to think with. So thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. See you next time. Thank you.